Am I audible to you all?
Yes, sir.
Very good. So I think our guest has joined us and then we can start.
Yes, sir.
Please go ahead.
Hello, sir. Hello.
Yes. Dr. Sumudu, good evening from my side and warm greetings from DNLU.
Thank you so much, and good morning to you from my side.
Good morning, dear. Okay, okay. Good morning to you. So, Veena, please start now.
Hello, sir.
Yes.
There was a technical problem. Yes, sir. Good evening, sir. Good evening, ma'am. We'll start. All right. So good evening, one and all who have joined us today. And this virtual meeting is a humble endeavor from the Center for Research in Environmental Law, DNLU, to commemorate this World Environment Day. Though the present situation has imposed various restrictions and limitations on our physical activities, let it not take our spirit and commitment towards our Mother Nature. So all the participants are requested to leave their questions, if any, in the chat box, and it will be addressed during the question and answer session. Now I request Mr. Aman, our second semester LLM student, to welcome the gathering. Aman.
Yes, ma'am. Am I audible to everyone?
Yes, sir.
Respected Professor Balraj, Honorable Vice Chancellor DNLU, Dr. Atapattu, our distinguished guest for the day, all other guests, teachers, and all participants. A hearty welcome to all of you to our today's webinar on climate change, human rights and justice, role of law and lawyers. In 1974, the United Nations designated June 5th as World Environment Day to highlight that the protection and health of environment is a major issue which affects the well-being of people and economic development throughout the world. The observance of this day provides us with an opportunity to broaden the basis for enlightened opinion and responsible conduct by individuals, enterprises, and communities in preserving and enhancing the environment. Since its recognition, the World Environment Day has globally provided platforms for raising awareness, encouraging people to take actions, and protecting the environment. Atharved mentions, Mata Bhumi Putroham Pritveha, which means Earth is my mother and I'm her child. Keeping this Indic knowledge in mind, the Center for Research Environment Cell has endeavors to respond to the need for legal scholarship in the areas of conservation of environment, abatement of pollution, preservation of biodiversity, improving environmental awareness, education, etc. With this commitment, the center aspires to be an incubator for new approaches on how can best address the complex and cross-cutting issues related to the problems faced by the environment. We are very honored to have Dr. Sumudu Atapattu as the speaker with us. Ma'am is an international jurist in human rights, environmental and climate change law. She started her academic career as an associate professor at the Faculty of Law University of Colombo, teaching international law and environmental law from 1995 to 2002. Concurrently, she worked as a senior research consultant at the human rights NGO, the Law and Society Trust, and as a consultant for FAO and UNDP in Colombo. In the year 2000, she was appointed as a Fulbright scholar, visiting both New York University School of Law and George Washington University Law School. In 2003, Ma'am was appointed as a lecturer, later moving to Associate Director, Director of Research Center at University of Wisconsin Law School, and then became the lead counsel for human rights and poverty eradication at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law. In 2012, she was awarded the Exceptional Achievement Award by the Sri Lanka Foundation for her contribution to human rights. Ma'am has been credited to editing and contribution to over 10 books and has authored over 70 papers of national and international repute. We welcome you, ma'am, for this virtual meeting. Professor Balraj Chauhan, our beloved Vice Chancellor, needs no introduction. He is the head of our big family, our mentor, and the guiding light. Being one of the senior most academicians of the country, with more than 38 years of experience of teaching and research, his knowledge and experience is the guiding light for all of us. Professor Chauhan's administrative capabilities is evident from the way he leads the university with the support and cooperation of the faculty members and administrative staff. It may not be an exaggeration if I say he is the most approachable person, and I'm sure that my teachers and friends will agree to this. I welcome you, sir, for this August virtual gathering. The center welcomes all the members of the faculty at DNLU whose unending support and cooperation is of great value. I also welcome and all the student members of CREL and whose efforts has been made this event possible. Welcome to all the participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Aman. I now request our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Balraj Chauhan, to address the gathering. Sir, please.
Thank you, Veena, and thank you, Aman, for a nice introduction. I am impressed by the credentials of our speaker today, Dr. Sumudu Atapattu. And I will say good morning, Dr. Sumudu, and good evening to all my friends who have joined. I'm extremely happy to join function organized by the Center for the Research in Environmental Law. Dr. Sumudu, this center is an endeavor of the university to respond to the need for legal scholarship and research in the area of conservation of environment and forest, abatement of pollution, preserving biodiversity, maintaining ecological balance, improving environmental awareness and education, etc. Though we are in the midst of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, I appreciate CREL efforts for organizing this guest lecture, and especially by you. It's a great pleasure for all of us. The theme, climate change, human rights and justice, role of law and lawyers, for today's lecture and the significance of this day is very important for the students of law. My dear students who are attending, and even those who are not attending, they must realize that World Environment Day is held every year on 5th June as established or decided by the United Nations General Assembly to mark the opening of the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment in 1972. It is one of the principal vehicles through which the United Nations stimulates worldwide awareness of the environment and enhances political attention and action. World Environment Day is the most appropriate occasion for environment action. For 2020, the theme is Biodiversity, a Call to Action to combat the accelerating species loss and degradation of the natural world. The recent outbreak of a novel coronavirus pandemic and the subsequent lockdown, which restricted human activity, gave time for nature to heal. Not just the skyline became clearer, the rivers are now visibly purer, and the once endangered flora and fauna is coming back to life. As countries start to plan ways to build back better, getting nature at the heart of all decision making for people and the planet must be our top priority. We need to find ways not only to live well in harmony with each other, but also with nature. Only by doing our part, we can allow nature to heal and ensure a better and healthier future for everyone. I will request you all for introspecting the recent events from Amphan cyclone to locust attack. And then you will realize that climate change has some or the other role to play behind these events. Biodiversity is the pillar that allows ecosystem to function and humans to thrive. It supports us and provides solution to every problem posed in front of us, provided we have the vision to see it. The recent lockdown due to corona has edified us about things which should be practiced in order to protect the environment, which we ignored before. It is high time now that we switch to alternative and sustainable measures to save ourselves and future generations from the wrath of nature. Because environment is something which belongs to all the creature inhabiting the earth, from microscopic to macroscopic ones. Hence, it is imperative that we learn to coexist on this planet rather than focusing the dominance of our species. And believe me, it will opt for eco-friendly banking in as many ways as possible. I call upon all of you as a student of law to engage yourself to design policies in such a way so that there is maximum use of alternative source of energy over conventional ones, and hence the environmental degradation due to our activities is minimal. I'm aware that there is belief among lawyers. Our speaker is also lawyering for environmental protection. That belief among the lawyers and the scholars that international environmental law is weak in comparison to international human rights laws. Scholars have therefore argued, and I hope that my expert will also argue on it. Scholars, they argue that international law claims are more likely to succeed if they can be reconceptualized as international human rights claims. So there is legal recognition for universal human rights to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. More researches are required in this direction, and I hope that Dr. Veena will take care of it just to find out. Future lawyers, my dear students, you are the future lawyers. All of you have to think about the viability of creating a new international dispute resolution structure. I'm emphasizing again because Dr. Atapattu will tell you that as far as the structure we are having for the resolutions, dispute resolutions, that is not adequate. So you have to think about the viability of creating a new international dispute resolution structure for climate change issues, including a new specialized international court on the environment. I don't know much about the environmental law. I'm just confessing before you. I am not a specialized person like our guest and like Dr. Veena. and you are studying environmental law, so you know more about it than me. But I think that there is a need of a dedicated, specialized international code for the environmental protection. For our guest, Dr. Sumudu, I would like to stress, you are from Sri Lanka and now you are in USA, that we Indians gave utmost importance and reverence to every element of nature. We worship the basic elements of the universe. We call it Panchbhuta, which included earth, water, fire, air, and space. It was considered to be dharma of every individual. The name of my university is Dharam Shastra National Law University, and we are teaching, preaching, and guiding our students to practice dharma. So this was the dharma of every individual to protect and conserve prakriti, or nature, or environment. Even today, such practices are followed. There is a need for the Western world. You are in USA, you can tell them about the practices, good practices for the protection of environment, what we followed in South Asia. To understand how ancient Indian maintained a symbiotic relationship with the earth and the natural resources. It is a need, I think, for the students of the Dharam Shastra National Law University to understand how ancient Indian literature like Vedas, Smritis, Samhitas, Puranas, Upanishads, Niti, Shastra, etc. are rich with references of the different aspects of the environment and its management, preservation, and protection. I would like to thank our learned speaker who accepted our invitation to enlighten and to satisfy the intellectual appetite of our students. I also thank Dr. Veena for her nice effort, and I congratulate you and your team also for this particular session on this very important issue and on Environmental Day. That is the most important part. So I wish all the success, and once again, I welcome our guest, and hopefully you will find this session interesting. And I call upon our students, ask as many questions as you can, because this is the way to learn. This is the way to learn. Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for such an enlightening speech. I request Madam Dr. Sumudu Atapattu to join us now. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much. Let me try and get my slides up. And you said I have 40 minutes?
Yes, yes, madam.
Okay, I will time myself. So I click share screen and then get my slides up. Can you see my screen?
Yes, ma'am.
You can see the slides?
No, ma'am. No, not the slides. Only just a blank screen is appearing right now. Yeah.
Oh, okay. And sorry about the technical difficulties. Do I need to get my slides up first and then click share screen?
Yes, ma'am. Share screen option, please use that.
Right. But do I need to get my slides up first?
No,
You need to
ma'am. You
open
need
it
to
and
click
yes.
the share screen and then you need to get the slides up.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Share screen.
Ma'am,
Okay.
click the share screen and then slides, ma'am.
So you still can't see it?
No, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am. It's visible now.
Okay. Where are my slides now? Sorry.
You can see it now, ma'am.
Give me a minute. Can you see now?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Okay, great. Slideshow from the beginning. Okay, great. So thank you so much for that introduction, for the invitation. Professor Vice Chancellor, that was very nice of you to chair this session. And I would like to also thank Dr. Veena for organizing this session and inviting me, and also the Center for Research in Environmental Law for organizing this session on this very important day. It is also a great pleasure for me to be part of this because I'm also from South Asia, so this feels very personal to me. And I'm actually very honored to have received this invite. So I thought, because this is a law school, I thought it's important for the future lawyers to see where they can make a difference and what the role of law and lawyers should be in relation to climate change. But as the Vice Chancellor pointed out, climate change is just part of the problem. It's a big problem affecting all of us, but there are lots of other problems that we are facing, including COVID-19, which is also connected to the environment. As lawyers and future lawyers, I think it's important for us to understand what the role of the law is and where lawyers can make a difference. And when I started many, many years ago, there was no field called environmental law in Sri Lanka. And, you know, in many parts of the world, environmental law was just beginning to be recognized as a separate branch of law. And we were not even teaching that at that time in Sri Lanka. You may know that the United States is, sorry, I forgot to time myself. United States actually was the first country in the world to pass legislation on the environment. The National Environmental Protection Act was adopted in 1969, which included provisions on environmental impact assessment. So US is a pioneer in this field. Unfortunately, currently, due to various political reasons, we have taken several steps backwards by actually downgrading these environmental safeguards that are in place for economic reasons, political reasons, etc. So, so this is the outline. We probably won't be able to get to all of them, but I want to highlight how much human beings have influenced nature to destroy nature, and also give some statistics on how much we have caused problems, basically. And then I want to turn to climate change specifically because obviously I cannot talk about all these environmental problems that we have created, but I feel that climate change is the most or the biggest environmental problem we are facing currently. And I will talk about climate change consequences specifically in South Asia, and then talk about the convergence of the human rights movement with climate change and why it is important to apply a human rights framing to climate change. And then if I have time, I will talk a little bit about human rights of vulnerable groups, the justice framework, and also the role of law and lawyers in relation to climate change. I also want to highlight that in addition to the World Environment Day, which is celebrated today, another day was celebrated or recognized 50 years ago as the Earth Day, and it's celebrated on April 22nd. And again, this was spearheaded by the then governor of Wisconsin, where I live, Gaylord Nelson. And our university's environmental institute is actually named after him. And this was the biggest sort of gathering 50 years ago that we saw in relation to the environment, the need to protect the environment. So some people are not aware of the link with our university, the link of the Earth Day with our university. So we do pay a lot of attention to environmental issues, not just law, but we adopt an interdisciplinary approach to environmental issues in our university. And I'm also affiliated with that institute. So one of the things that I would like to highlight is that we as human beings depend on nature for virtually everything. We are part of nature, although we tend to think that we can conquer nature. It's really a myth, because without the ecosystem services that are provided by nature, we cannot really survive. So if you look at this list, purification air, purification of water, decomposition of waste, a favorable climate, provision of food. I mean, where does our food come from? Our medicines, we depend on nature, biodiversity for our medicine and to provide shelter, etc., etc. We have seen the adverse consequences of air pollution. Delhi has a huge air pollution problem. In many parts of the world, air pollution is a big problem, leading to health issues. Similarly, bad water, polluted water is a huge problem. So if you look at this list, it's quite clear that human beings depend on nature for their very survival. So it's important for us to actually take a step back and recognize this. and to ensure that we keep nature, preserve nature, if only for selfish reasons, for our survival. But as we know, we have interfered with nature to such an extent that the natural equilibrium within nature has been lost. So our interference has been such that a new geologic era has been named after us, called the Anthropocene, right? Because of unlimited economic activity has caused irreversible ecological harm. So in the name of economic development, we have caused massive ecosystem destruction, and species have become extinct, and as we know, disrupted the planet's climate, generated vast amounts of toxic waste, exceeding the assimilative and regenerative capacity of nature. We have seen the negative consequences of this interference, and one example is, of course, climate change. So if you look at some of the statistics, the world has entered the 6th wave of mass extinction, whereby about 27,000 species vanish every year, and about 1 million species currently face extinction. And that's a massive amount of destruction. Climate change is accelerating more rapidly than the scientists have predicted. And unless we take aggressive mitigation measures, the temperature increase will likely to be around 3 to 5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And scientists agree that this temperature increase, which has already increased by about 1 degree Celsius, should be limited to 2 degrees if possible. 1.5 is great if we can do it, but above 2 degrees, the scientists are not sure what the repercussions will be. In addition, in 2016, the world generated 242 billion tons of plastic waste. And if these trends continue, there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish by 2050. And between 1945 and the present, the worldwide generation of hazardous waste increased from 5 million to 400 million tons per year. And much of this waste, as you know, is generated in the global north and exported to the poorer countries in the global south for disposal because it's much cheaper to do so. And this has been referred to as toxic colonialism because many of these countries lack the resources to dispose of these hazardous waste in a safe and environmental friendly manner. Similarly, heavy metals in soils to chemical contamination of air, water, and extraction of wealth from nature has rendered some places on Earth so toxic that they have become unsuitable for human habitation. There are places in the United States, for example, called cancer alleys. There are several places in China that have been called cancer alleys. They're so toxic that it's virtually impossible for people to live there. In addition, air pollution kills more than 7 million people per year. And lack of access to fresh water and sanitation is linked to about 5 million deaths per year again. I know that COVID has killed a lot of people worldwide, but when you compare the numbers that air pollution kills and water pollution kills, that pales in comparison. So we really need to do something about these unnecessary deaths that takes place every single year. The other issue that we need to recognize is that not every person or every state contributed equally to this environmental destruction. Not all segments of society lead unsustainable lifestyles. So we know that those who caused the contributed most to the problem, to creating the Anthropocene, are not those who will actually be affected most by these problems. So this sort of imbalance between those who benefit from economic activity and those who are affected or those who bear adverse social and environmental impacts is referred to as environmental injustice. And we know that in many parts of the world, polluting activities are predominantly located in poorer and racial minority areas. And currently, as you know, in the United States, there's a big movement requesting, demanding for racial justice. And environmental justice is very connected to that because there are studies after studies that show that these polluting activities are predominantly located in these poorer segments of society, in areas where racial minorities live. So leading to real injustices. So I will refer to the justice framework in addition to the human rights framework later on. So to get to climate change, this is basically what we are doing. We have put our earth on fire. And as I said earlier, the global temperature of the earth has increased by 1%, 1 degree centigrade already. And this is a permanent increase in temperature. We are not talking about day-to-day fluctuations in temperature. There's a permanent increase in temperature. I'm pretty sure you have seen this chart where the global temperatures have increased from the Industrial Revolution. And currently the temperature is off this chart actually, because this is up to 2000 and it keeps on increasing. And this is the contribution of greenhouse gases by the source. And as you can see, virtually everything we do contributes to climate change, and which makes it a huge challenge because you cannot really concentrate on one sector and say, okay, we are only going to look at our energy supply. We will not do anything about agriculture. We cannot really do that because if you look at the number, sure, the energy sector is the biggest sector that contributes to climate change, but transportation contributes to 13%, industry 19%, agriculture 14%, forestry and land degradation 17%. So you cannot really ignore one sector over the other. We have to address all these sectors. So because climate change is so intertwined with virtually everything we do, it becomes a really hard challenge to address all of these sectors at the same time. The other issue is, of course, if we target just one area, you might have an adverse impact on other areas. So for example, if you ignore forestry and just look at the energy sector and go for biofuels, for example, That could have an impact on deforestation. It could have an impact on agriculture. So we really need to adopt a holistic approach when it comes to climate change. And this poses a big challenge for lawyers as well, because you have to look at all these sectors, all these economic activities holistically. So how do you design a legal framework that addresses all these aspects? And then this chart shows the global greenhouse emissions by gas. And as you can see, carbon dioxide is the biggest culprit. Out of that, fossil fuel use is the biggest culprit, but we also have methane and nitrous oxide and carbon dioxide by other land use measures like deforestation that must be addressed as well. As you know, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is the scientific body established by the UN in 1988 that synthesizes research in relation to climate change. So the IPCC is considered as the main voice, the main scientific voice when it comes to climate change. They received the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 for their efforts to build up and disseminate greater knowledge about man-made climate change. So one of the issues, one of the biggest debates when the legal regime relating to climate change was being debated was whether the climate change was a man-made issue or whether it was a natural phenomenon. And if it was something natural, then of course there's nothing much we can do about it. But the IPCC clearly said in their 2014 report that this is man-made. Another issue is translating science into policy and law. And again, this is where lawyers come into the picture, because environmental law is one area of law which is heavily dependent on science. Lots of states, as you know, including the United States, have used scientific uncertainty as an excuse not to take measures. So how do you actually use this information in the IPCC reports and design a legal framework? So that's another challenge, because the language, if you look at the reports, the language that scientists use is very different from the legal language that we are used to. So how do we sort of bridge that gap is another challenge that the lawyers face. So the IPCC continued in their 2014 report that anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions have increased since the pre-industrial era, driven largely by economic and population growth, and are now higher than ever, right? This has led to atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide that are unprecedented in at least the last 800,000 years. And it went on to say, these are extremely likely to have been the dominant cause. The anthropogenic drivers are extremely likely to have been the dominant cause of the observed warming since the mid-20th century, right? So this report laid to rest the arguments relating to whether this was a man-made issue and whether this was actually happening, right? Because there were some doubts about that as well. And then in 2018, the IPCC was also asked to do a special report on the increase in temperature between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees, how likely, what do we need to do to get to 1.5 degrees versus 2 degrees? Again, the report highlighted the ethical and equitable aspects of climate change. Again, highlighted that these consequences fall disproportionately on the poor and vulnerable. And you can see the language used by the report. There's high confidence, and lawyers in law, we don't use that kind of language, right? And also referred to procedural and distributive dimensions of equity, and said requires fairness in burden sharing both between generations and between and within nations, right? So fairness in burden sharing, and that's not there, as I said, because there's a disproportionate burden on poor and vulnerable communities as well as states when it comes to climate change consequences, right? Um, and also the report recognized that if you limit the global warming to 1.5 degrees, that will substantially reduce the probability of extreme drought, precipitation deficits, and risks associated with water availability in some regions, right? Again, recognize that it'll affect human health, with primarily negative consequences, or also there will be an increase in vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue fever. So there was high confidence that these vector-borne diseases will increase with both 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees increase in temperature. It also recognized that poverty and disadvantage have increased with recent warming, and are expected to increase for many populations as average global temperature increase. Another issue that was highlighted was outmigration in agriculture dependent communities, because obviously there's not enough water for people to drink or cultivate food crops, then they may not have any option but to move to safer areas. In areas where that are affected by extreme weather events, again, if it's happening with more and more frequency, then people will have to move to safer areas. And the report recognized that states need to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030, and that's not very far away, and go carbon neutral by 2050. And that's coming pretty fast. So this is the IPCC and the reports that they produce. And if you look at some of the consequences of climate change in South Asia, these are actually not confined to South Asia. You will notice that these are global consequences. So water scarcity, food scarcity, flooding and drought. We have flooding on the one hand, as well as drought on the other hand. Increased severe weather events. Recently, India was hit by a hurricane. Although climate change is not the only reason why these severe weather events are taking place, scientists are in agreement that both the frequency and intensity of these severe weather events will get increased as a result of climate change. Sea levels are rising because of melting glaciers and warming seas due to thermal expansion. And that will lead to inundation of low-lying areas and complete submergence of small island states, like the Maldives, for example. And I already mentioned the health impacts, increased incidence of vector-borne diseases, heat waves, and waterborne diseases. And right now we are in the middle of a pandemic. And scientists again have recognized the link with deforestation and loss of habitat, because COVID is considered to come from animals to humans. These are called zoonotic spillover. And when there is more and more destruction of habitat, this is more and more likely to, pandemics like COVID are likely to increase. So just think about it, the fact that the entire world came to a standstill due to COVID, due to something that we cannot even see. Imagine if incidents like this, pandemics like this will increase in the future, what will the future look like? Loss of ecosystem services. I mentioned at the beginning that human beings depend on nature for survival, and if these ecosystem services are lost, then our survival might be in jeopardy as well. And there's increased wildfires. We saw how Australia was affected recently due to wildfires. So California regularly gets wildfires. So this is again one of the impacts of climate change. So if you look at the socio-political situation in South Asia, we do have very similar cultural backgrounds, but yet the countries are pretty diverse as well. So for example, we have the second largest population and an emerging world power, India. We have a small island state, the Maldives in the region. Sri Lanka is an island nation, so obviously sea level rise will affect Sri Lanka pretty badly, as well as the Maldives. Then there are landlocked countries, Nepal and Bhutan. So any legal response should take this diversity into account. So obviously one size fit all approach will not be possible for an area that's as diverse as South Asia. So the United Nations Development Program in their Human Development Report recognized as far back as in 2007 that millions of world's poorest people are already being forced to cope with the impacts of climate change. Right? Remember, this was more than 10 years ago. But increased exposure to drought, to more intense storms, to floods and environmental stress is holding back the efforts of the world's poor to build a better life for themselves and their children, right? So again, this highlights the disproportionate impact on poor and vulnerable sectors of society. And some of you may be familiar with Nicholas Stern's report on the consequences of climate change in South Asia. He highlighted that from the Himalayas, which feed water to 1 billion people, to the coastal areas of Bangladesh, South Asian countries must prepare for the effects of global warming, even as they work to combat the human causes of climate change. And the Stern review continued to say that more than 1/5 of Bangladesh could be underwater by the end of the century. There's advancing desertification, rising sea levels, and millions may be forced to migrate. And this aspect, migration or displacement due to climate change, is another area that requires legal attention, because as you probably know, currently international law protects only political refugees, not climate refugees. So climate refugees is not a legal category that's recognized under international law. So when people are forced to migrate across borders due to consequences relating to climate change, then that category of people are not protected under international law. So that's another area where lawyers need to get involved. Sorry. What are the other challenges in our part of the world? Poverty is a huge problem. Some of the poorest countries in the world are in South Asia. We have a high child malnutrition rate. This area is densely populated, and some countries have conflicts or they are coming out of conflicts, so rebuilding after these conflicts is another challenge. And of course, as we know, in 2004, the area was devastated by a tsunami. So these challenges have added to the problems relating to climate change. Displacement and migration, as I mentioned earlier, we have low-lying cities in South Asia like Dhaka, Mumbai, Karachchi. The entire coastal belt of Sri Lanka will be affected by sea level rise, and the Maldives is considered a small island state and is at the risk of completely disappearing. Even a few inches of sea level rise can have devastating consequences on these countries. The question, as I mentioned earlier, is how to deal with displacement and migration across international borders if the underlying reason is climate change. And currently, as I said, there's no international legal framework to address climate refugees. So if you look at some of the consequences, severe weather events, flooding, sea level rise, there will be an impact on agricultural yields, which is connected to water scarcity as well. In many parts of the world, agricultural productivity, the yield will go down considerably. There will be less water. So that will have a huge impact on food security as well as water security. Droughts and desertification again are increasing, and we are actually seeing these consequences even now. And then again, flooding. This is a picture from India or maybe Bangladesh. We are very familiar with these consequences already. And these are the consequences we see as a result of a 1 degree increase in temperature. And imagine what it will look like if we have 2 degrees increase in temperature. The World Bank believes that we are headed towards a 4 or 5 degree increase in temperature. So the future is not looking great, unfortunately. So looking at the human rights framework, I quickly want to talk a little bit about the human rights framework. Some of you may be familiar with that. There is a vertical relationship. So human rights operate vertically between states as duty bearers and people, the citizens, as right holders. And this relationship is confined to the territory. So in other words, human rights law does not actually apply extraterritorially. So for impacts for environmental issues like climate change, which is a global environmental problem, the human rights framework may not really work. It might be harder to apply the human rights framework because it's confined to the territory. And as we know, the main human rights instruments are the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted in 1948, and the two covenants, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In addition, of course, we have many specialized treaties governing groups like women, children, indigenous people, disabled people, and migrant workers, and specialized topics like torture, racial discrimination, and enforced disappearance. And there are lots of rights that are recognized and protected under international human rights law. Starting from right to life to a right to a nationality. But one of the things that I want to highlight is that international human rights law does not recognize a right to a healthy environment yet. Several regional treaties, human rights treaties do recognize this right, but international human rights law is lagging behind and does not yet recognize this right. But victims have used the human rights framework to seek relief for environmental issues. And there are many, many examples at the national level, at the international level, at the regional level. And India actually has been at the forefront of articulating these environmental rights by interpreting the existing rights expansively. So right to life has been interpreted as including a right to a healthy environment, and this in relation to this public interest litigation, and many of these the jurisprudence of the Indian Supreme Court has had a huge impact on the judiciaries in other parts of South Asia as well. So India has really played a pioneering role in articulating environmental rights. The convergence between human rights and environmental protection has been going on for some time. Again, there are some drawbacks that we need to be aware of, because obviously the human rights framework apply to humans. But again, here we see some developments, very interesting developments taking place, where other species are being given rights, like in India, for example, where rivers have been granted rights. In New Zealand, again, rivers have been granted rights. And there's a very interesting advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, which recognized that there is a separate right to a healthy environment, and that protects nature separately, in addition to protecting people. So these developments are taking place within the human rights framework as well, right? But we need to be aware of the drawbacks of the human rights framework as well. So I think I will skip some of these slides and look at climate change and human rights, because I think it's important for us to recognize that climate change will have an impact on all the protected rights that are recognized under international, if not all, at least most of the rights that are recognized under human rights law. Accountability for historic emissions, in other words, for the consequences that we are seeing now, is a little hard to establish, because, as I said, this is a cumulative problem. Every state in the international community has been contributing to the problem. So it's hard for us to identify one state or a group of states that are responsible for the problems. But when it comes to mitigation and adaptation measures, then states do have human rights obligations that they must fulfill when they are giving effect to their mitigation and adaptation measures that they are implementing within their countries. The legal framework, again, something I want to highlight. I know I'm out of time, but I want to take a few minutes to highlight the legal framework because the contribution of states to the problem, the ability to respond to the problem, as well as the vulnerability to the consequences vary considerably. And also because there's a time lag between emissions and the consequences. And also those who will be affected most will be the future generations. Designing a legal framework to take all these factors into consideration has been a big challenge. As you know, the global north is predominantly responsible for the consequences of climate change, whereas the most impacts will be felt in the global south and in poorer segments of society in the global north as well. The legal framework consists of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Kyoto Protocol, the Doha Amendment, and then, of course, the Paris Agreement in 2015. If you look at the climate documents, there was no mention of human rights until the Cancun adaptation framework in 2012, and then, 2010, and then the Paris Agreement in 2015 was the first time, was the first binding climate document that referred to human rights. Quickly looking at the justice framework, there are 4 elements that comprise the justice framework. The distributive justice aspect requires us to allocate both benefits and burdens in a fair manner, not just burdens. Procedural justice requires us to adopt open, informed, and inclusive decision-making processes, so not exclude women, for example, from the decision-making process, so have a more inclusive decision-making process. Corrective justice requires us to compensate for past wrongs and hold those who are responsible accountable. And then finally, the final aspect is social justice, which recognizes that these environmental struggles are intertwined with other forms of justice, like economic and racial justice that, as I mentioned, that we see today in the United States. I will skip these. I just want to highlight some of the aspects, some of the steps that South Asia has taken. There's a SARC declaration and an action plan on climate change, and also the International Solar Alliance that India was at the forefront in establishing. And I'm going to skip these and get to the role of law and lawyers. As I mentioned, climate change requires adopting new laws, amending old ones, and ensuring that traditional areas of law like contracts, property, administrative law, constitutional law, insurance law, accommodate climate change and its consequences. There's no way that we can ignore the consequences of climate change on these traditional areas of law. And also, almost all countries have submitted their nationally determined contributions and states have to adopt adaptation measures to protect its citizens from the consequences of climate change. So all these require lawyers and new laws. And these changes have to be made at international, regional, national, and subnational levels. An area that requires urgent attention relates to statehood and sovereignty. When it comes to small island states, I mentioned the Maldives. If a state loses its territory, then what happens to its statehood and sovereignty? Does that state disappear? What happens to the people? What happens to people who cross an international border due to climate change? And another important area is bringing test cases. And as you know, India has been at the forefront of action relating to public interest litigation. And this must continue in the area of climate change as well, to build jurisprudence. And there are several interesting cases that are taking place all over the world. And again, lawyers and law students must be at the forefront. I think, this slide shows how people respond to climate change. Because obviously climate change is a very daunting challenge. And some people feel that everything is lost. Some people feel that it's in God's hands now. Some people deny the problem. And that is the real problem we have when people deny the existence of climate change. Some people feel that it's too overwhelming. It is an overwhelming problem because, as I said, it's connected to everything we do. Some people feel that, oh, everything will be okay somehow. Unfortunately, another category of people feel that it's not their problem. Particularly the older generation might feel, oh, by the time, these consequences take place, we'll be dead and gone, so we don't have to worry about it. But I'm hoping that most of you are all of you are solutionists, and answers can be and must be found. If we created this problem, then obviously we should be able to find answers. So to conclude, climate change is a complex problem and can often seem overwhelming. As I said, virtually everything we do contributes to it. Every country in the world, every sector of the economy is contributing. And we are unfortunately fast approaching tipping points from which no return is possible. As I mentioned, there's a World Bank report recognizes that we are approaching an increase of 4-degree increase in temperature. And the longer we wait, the harder the choices will become. And as you saw, the IPCC report highlighted that we need to cut down our greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030. We created this problem, so we should try and solve it. Climate change affects almost all protected rights, and a human rights framework should be applied to mitigation, adaptation, displacement, and severe weather events. So I think I will stop there. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. Ma'am, for convenience sake, I've codified all the questions. I've consolidated everything, and I'll be asking you one by one.
Okay. Do you want to take like 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then in the interest of time? I don't mind.
Ma'am, I'll ask you one by one. I think that is not a problem.
Okay.
A few questions. Okay. Ma'am, first question is, like, this climate change and the entire thing related to it is a very technical area. So how we can integrate the scientific knowledge and legislative wisdom, especially when we are thinking from the perspective of lawyers and law researchers. So how can we integrate these two things? That's the first question, ma'am.
Right. Well, as I said, you do need expertise in the technical knowledge to some extent if you want to become good lawyers. And that's why it's quite challenging for lawyers. But without that technical knowledge, obviously you'll need a team of experts to design a proper legal framework. But if you take something like carbon trading, for example, you do need lawyers, but you also need economists. I didn't mean to say that lawyers should be able to do all of these by themselves, but an interdisciplinary approach is important. So you need scientists, you need economists, you need people with the technical know-how, but you also need lawyers because an important piece that's missing, and we are not really training our lawyers for that missing piece, because we don't really recognize that we need lawyers for these areas, right? As I said, many countries submitted their nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC. So these involve mitigation measures in various areas. So in order to give effect to these mitigation measures, we need lawyers. How do we, so for example, if India said we are going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 20% in the energy sector, right? How do you give effect to that commitment, right? Do we go for solar energy? Do we go for bioenergy? How are we going to give effect to that? What is the legal framework that will enable us to give effect to those commitments, right? Let's take adaptation measures. Let's assume that we have to move a particular village from a flood-prone area because they're going to be affected year after year. How are we going to do that? What are their property rights? How are we moving an entire community to a different area? How are we going to relocate them? What about their livelihood aspects? So there are lots of legal issues that come into the picture. Are we going to get their opinion on where they're going to be relocated? Right now in the United States, an entire community, and it's an indigenous community, is being relocated because they're currently in an island and that area is going underwater. So it's no longer possible for them to live there, but many people don't want to move because generations of their ancestors have lived in that area and they don't want to move. But there are legal issues that come into the picture that need to be addressed. So we do need a certain level of technical expertise, but for that you need to work with people who have that expertise, but lawyers' role is crucial.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. My second question is with regard to climate refugees. So various studies have pointed out that climate-induced displacement, it will be more than 143 million by around 2050. So is there a need for changing the international laws and also institutional restructuring is necessary to mitigate these problems, the problem of climate refugees?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, part of the problem is that climate change will not be the only reason as to why people move. So establishing the causal link with climate change will be hard. And the numbers range from 20 million to 200 million by 2050. And that's a huge number of people. And if you add the people who are currently living on small island states, the number will be higher. So there are lots of issues here. As I said, the current legal framework does not recognize climate refugees. But for the first time, the Paris Agreement or the decisions taken at the Paris Conference established a task force to look into climate-induced displacement. Again, they recognize that the current legal framework is not adequate, but didn't really say we need a new legal framework. There have been some developments in this area. We still don't really have a label to call this because climate refugees is not a legal term. We don't have a legal framework. The only sort of framework that has been adopted is by the Nansen Initiative to govern those who are displaced due to disasters. So there it's much easier because you can actually see a disaster happening. And if people are displaced across borders, then this legal framework will come into play. But again, it's a soft law instrument. The other big issue is about the people on small island states. What will happen to their state if these countries disappear altogether? Take the Maldives, for example. Where are the people going to go? Obviously, they'll have to be relocated somewhere safe in another country. Will they be relocated as a state? It's unlikely that one state will recognize another state within their borders. One of the solutions that the Maldives has sort of tried to enforce is artificial islands. They constructed an artificial island, but it's really expensive to do that. Currently we have close to 50 small island states. So are we going to construct artificial islands for all of them? Who is going to pay for
Again,
that?
that will add to the problems. You're making artificial islands means, again, that is human intervention there.
It's a human intervention, and also the Law of the Sea Convention does not actually recognize artificial islands as being entitled to maritime boundaries. So that's another issue. We don't really know the extent of the environmental impact of these artificial islands. So yeah, as you point out, there are lots of issues there as well. But I think the biggest concern will be where to relocate these people.
So ma'am, my next question is, like, there is a controversial theory. Like, on the one side, we say that the entire climate change is a problem which has resulted from the human actions or human intervention. Or can we see it as a natural phenomenon, like it happens as a process of evolution? So what is your viewpoint on this idea?
There may be some natural element involved, but there is sufficient scientific evidence to show that, remember that chart I showed at the beginning, that the temperature has increased consistently since the Industrial Revolution. So something has happened since then. And there's enough evidence now to show that this is due to the greenhouse gas emissions by states. So the IPCC has
Shantana, please mute your.
There's enough evidence to show that this is due to human intervention. And unless we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by 50%, and go carbon neutral by 2050, the consequences will probably be catastrophic.
Ma'am, if time permits, can I ask you a few more questions?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay. Ma'am, the next question is regarding specifically with regard to South Asia. South Asia is witnessing several challenges in terms of climate change and associated risks. So what is the future of climate litigation in Global South?
So I think one of the successes of litigation in South Asia, particularly with regard to public interest litigation, has been the recognition of a right to a healthy environment in South Asia. And as I said, India has been a pioneer in this area. And if we recognize, if we apply that jurisprudence to climate change, then it's obvious that something has to be done to ensure that citizens of South Asia or India or whatever the country we are talking about have a suitable climate to live in. So how do we ensure that? By ensuring that we reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. But the problem I have with that framing is that the countries in South Asia or in the Global South are not the countries that contributed most to the problem, right? So what is the responsibility of the Global North in all this, right? Shouldn't they bear a disproportionate burden when it comes to climate change? Shouldn't they pay for some of these measures that the Global South is forced to take because they did not really benefit from the economic development that resulted in climate change, right? So I strongly feel that the Global North should be held accountable under the common but differentiated responsibility principle that form the legal framework relating to climate change in relation to at least the loss and damage mechanism or adaptation measures. Some countries are obviously contributing to these funds, but what about the companies that profited from fossil fuel extraction that are still profiting by contributing to climate change? What is their responsibility? So I think that's where the litigation will play an important role by holding those who profited from this accountable for the damage that they are causing. And there are good signs, good litigations taking place. For example, in the Philippines, the Human Rights Commission received a complaint against carbon majors in relation to climate change. These companies, there was a complaint brought against the companies that profited from fossil fuel extraction. So I think lawyers can bring, even if they fail, it doesn't matter. It's one of the ways of drawing attention to the problem, the fact that these companies should be held accountable. In some ways, we need to adopt new laws to hold them accountable. So there are lots of different ways of getting shareholders involved, calling shareholders to ask them to not to invest in these companies. So there are lots of things that can be done in addition to litigation. But I think litigation is an important piece to hold those who are accountable to pay for the damage that they have caused.
Now we have a question from Ankit sir. When it comes to foreign investments in developing countries, the corporations investing would of course not want strict laws which govern them. And if they are strict with the laws, investment may not come. So the question is, in the light of this above statement, environment law is a myth when it comes to investments by foreign corporations. What is your comment on that now?
Yeah, that's one of the biggest problems the global south faces when it comes to investment. Actually, there are several problems. One is the one-sided nature of investment law, because the investors are given or shielded from being sued when it comes to environmental damage or social destruction and things like that. There are clauses in these investment treaties which says that you cannot change your environmental law. You have to freeze the law at the time these investment treaties are entered into. I mean, what does that mean? Why are we shielding these investors? Obviously, countries like ours, we need investment. There's no doubt about it. But there should be some accountability on the part of these investors, because the investors have been given the right to sue states if the investment agreement is not applied. So, for example, in Ecuador, for example, where there was massive environmental damage, massive human rights violations, um, the company Chevron filed action against Ecuador and under their investment treaty, and Ecuador was forced to pay millions of dollars in damages to the company that created all these problems, whereas those who were affected are still without compensation. So this one-sided nature of investment treaties require action. Um, we need, as the Vice Chancellor pointed out, some forum to seek damages for environmental damages, for environmental degradation. The human rights framework has sort of been helpful to some extent, but there are drawbacks of the human rights framework. The extraterritorial aspect is a huge problem. The other issue is these multinational companies that invest in the global south operate in the gray area between national law and international law. They are not states, so they are not subject to international law. And because their subsidiary is incorporated under the national laws of the investing state, they are not, the parent company is not subject to the laws of the investing, the host state, basically. So you cannot really bring a claim against the parent company for the damage that's being caused to the host state. And they make sure that the subsidiary does not control a lot of wealth, so that, take Bhopal, for example. That was one of the worst industrial accidents in history. But, it was a settlement because the government of India intervened, but they were not able to go against the parent company, Union Carbide, in the United States. So this whole structure, and relating to investment law, international trade law, really favors the global north. And this can be traced back to the colonial era, where these laws were actually designed and adopted when most of our countries were under colonial domination. So we didn't really take part in designing these laws and adopting these laws. So that's why I feel that lawyers in the global south really need to get together and work together to change some of these one-sided laws that favor these companies. We really need to do something about that.
All right, ma'am. The next question is from Pratishta. She has asked, in spite of so many treaties and conventions, we are seeing the condition of climate change getting bad to us. In your opinion, is there any possible way to establish a bridge between UNFCCC and WTO? And also, can we actually penalize the nations which does not fulfill the international legal obligations related to climate change?
So this goes to the very heart of international law, because international law is very different from national law, as many of you know, and we don't really have the structures at the international level to enforce international law, except in relation to investment law and trade law. There is a particular forum to bring these disputes. Interestingly, one of my students this semester did a paper on climate change and the WTO, looking at some of the cases to see whether climate change cases could be brought before the WTO. My concern is that WTO is a trade body, not a climate change or an environmental body. So their focus is very different from, say, the UNFCCC or the Conference of Parties. So one problem is the structure of international law itself, because states have to regulate themselves and enforce international law themselves, because there's no sort of supranational body to enforce international law. The second problem is politics, really. I mean, the countries that are the most culpable are the countries that are not really doing anything about it. In the United States, for example, this has become a huge political issue. It has become a debate between climate change versus livelihoods, which is not really the case, because you know, the people who are working in coal mines, obviously it's their livelihood, but they are under such severe health problems. They have huge health issues that nobody is talking about those. And there are lots of jobs to be made in the renewable energy sector that, again, nobody is talking about. So this environment versus jobs, environment versus economy debate really has to change, because it's not one or the other. It's, as I said, it's the environment is everything. And if we go down this path, climate change will affect, just like COVID did. Again, we see the same debate taking place between public health and the economy. It's not one or the other, it's one. So people really need to recognize that, and we need politicians who recognize that and not think about short-term political advantage over long-term, you know, environmental stewardship and environmental health of people. For climate change, we really need to adopt a more longer term view of development than very short term political advantage.
All right, ma'am. So now there is a question from Swapnil. He is asking, what is your viewpoint on this news that a proposal to build two huge barriers, one that would connect Norway to Scotland, the other France to England? It was described as a warning about the urgency of climate crisis. So what is your viewpoint on this?
What are these? I haven't heard of these bridges, you said?
Yes, huge barriers that would connect Norway to Scotland and the other France to England.
What kind of barriers are these?
Can you explain more on this, Swapnil, so that we'll come back to that question later?
Okay.
Can I ask you another question now?
Sure.
Yeah. Can green free trade agreements become the new dimension for nations to offer environmental leadership?
Green?
Free trade agreements.
Well, I think it can, but as I said, the current international legal structure, if we do it within the current international legal structure, we probably won't go too far. Because as I said, the investment law, the trade law, they are very one-sided. They don't give prominence or they don't highlight environmental concerns or human rights concerns. Their main focus is on investment, protecting the investor or trade. So unless we change the existing structure, within just labeling something as green is not going to help us. We really need to take a step back and look at the existing structures to see where the problems are in order to see how we can make the system better to address climate change. And most of the systems will have to change if we are serious about addressing climate change.
So the question from Mukil is somewhat associated to what you have already mentioned. He is asking for suggestions in the legal framework that would be a solution for combating the climate change.
Suggestions in the legal framework to combat climate change. Okay, so there are lots of things that have to be done. One of the things is that the existing commitments that states have made are not sufficient. So even if you combine all the NDCs that states have made, we are likely to end up with a 4-degree or a 5-degree increase in temperature than a 2-degree. Forget about a 2-degree increase, which is considered as a safe level. So we really need drastic commitments from states, from all states. Secondly, I think we need the global north to take greater responsibility for creating the problem and help developing countries, the global south, to fulfill their commitments. Particularly with regard to mitigation, we need technology, we need help with resources, we need help with technology. So they need to bear a greater responsibility when it comes to mitigation and adaptation. And all these require legal solutions, right? At the international level to the subnational level, because there are lots of things that we can do at the subnational level, at the municipal level as well. Better transportation, better renewable sources of energy, even our agricultural practices. We need to look at the legal frameworks that we have adopted. Some of them date back to the colonial era. How do we make these better to address the challenges posed by climate change? What are the new laws that we need? So for example, at the international level, the state responsibility principles are really outdated. They are very bilateral in nature. They cannot accommodate something as complex as climate change, where there are multiple actors, multiple victims, multiple sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So we really need to change that structure too. We don't have a collective theories of liability at the international level, whereas at the national level, some of these developments have taken place in relation to pharmaceuticals, for example. So can we look at some of these developments and apply them at the international level? So there are lots of areas that require change when it comes to something as complex as climate change. causation is a huge problem. How do we establish that the damage that we are suffering today is the result of the emissions that were emitted by a particular state or states, right? This issue arose in the Inuit case, for example, that was brought by the Inuit of Canada and the United States against the United States for causing climate change, which resulted in the violation of rights of these Inuit people. But they are under the current causation principles, they cannot really establish that the damage they are suffering is the result of the US, the emissions of the United States. But the United States is responsible for 1/4 of all greenhouse gas emissions. Can we ignore that? So how do we accommodate that within the international legal framework? So those are some of the things that we really need. We need to start from the basics and try and change some of the laws that we have to accommodate something as complex as climate change. And science is evolving. Science has shown the exact contribution of some of these companies, big companies that have contributed to climate change. There's a very interesting chart compiled by the World Resources Institute, which shows how much these companies have contributed over the years. Can we use that in litigation? You know, what are the novel ways that, novel theories that we can come up with to establish causation? Can we use, reverse the burden of proof and ask the culprits to show that they did not contribute to the problem? So I think that's why litigation would be an important piece of this, to come up with novel legal theories. And there are signs that this is happening, but we need more. And there's also an urgency to the problem. We cannot afford to wait longer, really.
Ma'am, one last question. The clarification for the earlier question has come.
Okay.
He's telling the New York Times on 14th February 2020 have reported that Europe has planned to build barriers in sea so that if in future seawater rise, these dams will be able to stop that water and protect Europe. So he was referring to that. Is it showing actually that there is an urgency in discussing the climate crisis?
I see. Okay. So these are like dams to prevent the sea level from rising and affect. Okay. Again, I mean, you can really see the north-south dimension to this because, you know, the global north can afford to spend millions of dollars on these elaborate mechanisms to protect themselves. And there has been talk about floating islands, for example. But what about the global south? They don't have the resources to do this type of thing. And then what about the environmental impact of building all these dams, right? People have been talking about building seawalls to protect the coastal areas. Again, it's a resource issue. It's an equity issue. It's a justice issue. If you have contributed to the problem, if your contribution is disproportionately higher than the rest of the world, you should have a legal obligation to address that. Help those who are disproportionately affected by your actions. It's a corrective justice issue, right? So the global north will be able to invest in some of these adaptation mechanisms, but what about the global south? Who is going to help them, right? And then what are the long-term impacts of, you know, these options? And geoengineering is another example of a remedy that is being proposed in relation to climate change. And again, these are very drastic measures that have been proposed, like injecting aerosols into the atmosphere, planting stuff on the ocean floor to absorb carbon dioxide. And, there are really drastic measures that have been proposed to address climate change because states are not doing enough to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. But there's a big unknown there. We don't really know the long-term impacts of these geoengineering mechanisms as well. So shouldn't we apply a precautionary approach to this, because we don't really know the implications of these. So are we creating a bigger monster by trying to solve one problem? I don't know. But on the other hand, a 4-degree increase in temperature might be the end of civilization. We don't know. Even now, so many people are suffering as a result of climate change. And that's with a 1-degree increase in temperature. Imagine what a 4-degree increase in temperature would look like. So yeah, it's a balancing act, but the bottom line is that states need to do more. The global north needs to do more to help the global south because they are responsible for this problem.
All right, ma'am. So I think with this we can conclude. So I request Reet Bose, student of 4th semester BLLB Honours, to propose a vote of thanks to you.
Thank you so much.
Ma'am, 1 second.
Sure.
Am I visible?
Yes, yes.
Good evening, everyone, and good morning to you, ma'am. John F. Kennedy has rightfully said that we must definitely stop and thank people who make a difference in our lives. Now, so I, Reet Bose, on behalf of Dharmashastra Law University's Center for Research in Environmental Law, am here to propose a vote of thanks. First and foremost, I'd like to thank the Lord for making this event a huge success. Now, I thank our esteemed guest speaker, Dr. Atapattu, a master in her field, to spare some precious time from her busy schedule and to impart the unparalleled knowledge that she has today. We are very grateful to you, ma'am. Thank you so much. I would also take this opportunity to thank our Vice Chancellor, who is our unwavering guiding light in all pursuits. This gratitude will also be incomplete without mentioning Veena ma'am, who has made invaluable efforts behind the scenes to make this event possible. Thank you, ma'am. I would thank all the faculty members for their committed support. Lastly, I thank all the students for their keen participation and patient listening. I would like to conclude by saying that today we should realize that every breath of air we take, every mouthful of food we eat, comes from the natural world. If we damage our natural world, we damage ourselves. It is not a question of beauty or interest. It is the essence of human life, which is a healthy planet. And we, as environmental law students, must pledge to preserve and protect it. Thank you and happy Environment Day.
Thank you, Reet. Thank you, ma'am, once again.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. And thank you for the questions.
We are honored, ma'am.
And I'm happy to send you my slides if you want to share with the students.
Definitely, definitely, ma'am. I'll do that.
Great.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Have
Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, all the participants. So we'll wind up the meeting.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yes, ma'am.